one of the better known models for pricing employee stock options was developed by Hull and White as early as 2002. This paper here I took from the John Hull's homepage, and but there was a more subsequent publication in 2004. So Hull and White 2004 is generally the date associated with the paper. What this paper in fact really attempts to do is to take the binomial framework and, using Cox-Ross-Rubinstein, nest in a set of features that the Financial Accounting Standards Board wanted to integrate into the pricing of options. So because options are a relatively significant component of executive pay, to give you some idea how substantial stock options are to CEO pay, by the early 2000s, a fairly substantial component of overall pay of the median grant date compensation for CEOs in the S&P 500 firms was close to being half of overall pay. Now that went up from a relatively low base, and then we can see subsequently, perhaps because of the tech bubble, perhaps because of change in taxation policies, perhaps because of change in accounting regulations, the amount of overall pay that came in the form of stock options declined. But even as late as 2011, it's still not insignificant. A more recent from Equilar, I took some figures from Equilar, again updating as far as 2015, S&P 500 median reported pay components, options relative to others were still relatively significant. The big change went from being relying on options to relying on restricted stocks, essentially. So it's still important, again, having a timeline here in terms of those accounting standards and perhaps impacts. One nice summary of the impact of accounting standards and an outline of the accounting standards comes in this Siventik-Wiener-Zapatero paper of 2006. And basically they outline a kind of changing landscape where accounting standards as early as 1995 were requiring some kind of expensing of stock-based compensation at the moment compensation was granted, and the accounting standards had shifted from using what was traditionally used, the intrinsic value of the option, to reporting fair value, and fair value is now a core principle of most accounting standards for the US and also globally. But fair value means you expense the option not at its intrinsic value, which can be zero, but at fair value, which can be substantially higher than zero. And the reason why the intrinsic value very often is zero for employee stock options, especially at the moment the option is granted, is the option typically can be granted at the stock price. So the exercise of the option is equal to the stock price on the day the option is granted. So that was a change, a relatively significant change, but wasn't mandatory. It was a kind of a recommendation. But then in 2005, that became stronger than just a recommendation. That became an obligation, and the regulation was amended, replaced by FAS 123R, which became mandatory towards end of 2005. FAS 123R requires, instead of simply encouraging, as FAS 123, the use of fair value methods of accounting to compute the value of the option compensation. So we moved to a situation where the option was being mandatory. Now, in as early as 2002, Hull and White developed what they referred to as the enhanced FAS FASB model. So we might just have a look at how they describe this particular model and what its relevance is. First of all, of course, they didn't refer to the model developed here as the Hull and White 2004 model. They referred to it as Enhanced FASB 123. And what they tried to capture was the enhancements that had been introduced by FASB 123 deal with features listed at the beginning of this article in terms of the theoretical weaknesses of the existing framework. So explicitly consider the possibility employees will leave the company after the vesting period, and then requires the company to use employee turnover rates, estimate employee exit rate, E, which applies to both the pre-vesting and post-vesting, and it explicitly incorporates employee early exercise policy, and it does this by assuming that the early exercise happens when the stock price is a certain multiple of the exercise price. So that's something that was quite different from existing models and is the hallmark of Hull and White. The basic framework they used was the binomial model, and the issues that they tried to address in that model was to take specific features of early exit, vesting, post-vesting, and kind of a barrier specification, and incorporate that directly into a Cox-Ross-Rubenstein model. One of the issues, of course, related to this is that when you actually estimate the Hull-White model, it doesn't converge quickly. It has a tendency to do what most barrier options do, and that is you get convergence that is very, very slow. And Civentic, Wiener, Zapatero, for these specified parameter values, they noticed that when you implement Hull-White in a binomial type framework, if the true value is 27, 85, 51, even after many thousands of steps, 40,000 steps, we're relatively far, using this binomial model, from what they consider to be true. Okay, so that is an issue, and we may be able to get a kind of a graph here that demonstrates the extent to which that convergence is sluggish. So yes, there's two graphs here. So the nature of the convergence, first of all, is that it's tooth-shaped. It's non-monotonic. So one of the frustrating things with binomial models that try to price options with barriers, and also true with Hull-White, is that the convergence looks like this. It's not monotonic. You don't get, you don't progress to true in a nice, relatively stable type fashion. Even when you push the estimation steps up to 5,000, which is relatively high, you're not getting a stable type of convergence to true. Okay, so that's an issue that has to be dealt with. Given the high number of steps, of course, that's been required, these type of estimations can be very slow. And in our paper, just to take up, that we developed, we did run some large-scale estimations. Download this paper. We did run some large-scale estimations using the original Hull-White specifications, and we also found that the nature of convergence was had that sawtooth-shaped type of convergence. Okay, so we ran estimates up to 10,000 here, and again you can see using the same parameter values outlined by Civentic, Zapatero, Wiener, Zapatero 2008, we're not converging. However, if you incorporated a Boileau specification, so Boileau 1994, into the Hull-White model, actually convergence happens much more rapidly and remarkably quickly. So we have, if you like, the true value as specified by Civentic et al. When we augment the Hull-White model to take into account Boileau, the yellow here gives you a sense of the proximity to true. So that's a relatively radical improvement, and it's kind of a parsimonious type of specification that you can incorporate into the Hull-White model. Okay, so a couple of things to note then. What the Hull-White model basically does is it sets out, just go back through here to the paper. It sets out a series of regions. Okay, so effectively Hull-White breaks down the estimation of the employee stock option into the vesting period and the vesting period, and then the post vesting period. Okay, so we have the period when the option cannot be exercised. So it's, in other words, the option may have a life of 10 years. In the earlier period, the option cannot be exercised. So if you like, the holder of the option has some skin in the game. They have collateral. You are granted an option, but you cannot exercise it for maybe 2 years or maybe 4 years. The full life of the option could extend to maybe 10 years. After 4 years has passed or 2 years has passed, then in the post-vesting period, you are allowed to exercise early. If the option is out of the money, so if the stock price falls and you leave the company early, you in effect lose that option. You have to surrender the option and its value is forfeited. If you leave the company and the option is higher than the exercise, you realize the intrinsic value. There is also this feature built into the Hull-White model, which is different from any normal specification in Cox-Ross-Rubenstein, but if the stock price exceeds some multiple of the exercise price, where the M here could be a value like 1.5 or 2, if the stock price exceeds the exercise times the multiple, then the option will automatically exercise, and you realize the intrinsic value on that specific date. Okay, so that's something that's different. It's also what we would call here a barrier, right? The option has a barrier specification, and it's this barrier specification that creates the non-linear type convergence that we observed before. The way we deal with that is we use Boileau specification, and we what basically Boileau tries to do is take that barrier and then stretch the array, the binomial array, the binomial tree, so that the nodes line up on the barrier, right? And so basically when you enter a particular value for the number of steps, Boileau will search until we arrive at a point where a node is placed close to the barrier, right? The next node up. And that in effect then means that when we price the option, we're getting relatively close to the true value. Okay, so that is the improvement that's introduced. What we also do in this particular model is we, in addition to applying Boileau, we do two other things to speed up estimation times, and the estimation speeds actually improve relatively dramatically. First of all, we can truncate the region above the early exercise. So if an early exercise occurs, it means that the option is exercised, and that's it. The option in effect is dead. We don't need to calculate these nodes here in the binomial tree. Otherwise, there's also a zero region in the tree, and that's common in every Cox-Ross-Rubenstein tree. Effectively, we can truncate that as well. So our estimation now doesn't include these subtrees. It just will include what we have here, the blue, and then in the vesting period. Also, something that's relatively important in the estimation that we will set out is that generally there are models, binomial models use static memory. Every node is recorded in the memory. That saps up a lot of processing power. In the type of tree we develop, we use this concept of dynamic memory, where we only estimate at any given time the node values in each of the columns and then they pass back. And that's very efficient.